My friend and I decided to be alone in the winter forest, but as it turned out, someone was watching us. The consequences haunt me to this day. I'm 28 now, but this story takes me back to when I was 19 and spent my winters in a small New England town. I had just finished my first semester at college and was eager to spend the holiday break at home. Our house was perched on the edge of a forest. Nothing special, but it was cozy. Winters here weren't just cold, they were brutal. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache and turns your breath into icy clouds the second you step outside. My friend Mike and I had planned a little adventure. Mike was the kind of guy who thrived on spontaneity, always suggesting things like midnight hikes or impromptu road trips. We decided to go on a winter hike, just the two of us. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a few hours on a well-marked trail that wound through the woods before looping back to town. It had snowed the night before, so everything was blanketed in a pristine layer of white. Mike picked me up that morning in his beat-up Jeep. He was all smiles, dressed in layers that made him look like a walking marshmallow. We joked about how neither of us had the stamina for a long hike, but decided to go anyway. By the time we parked at the trailhead, the sun was high, glinting off the snow and making the forest look like something out of a postcard. The first hour was uneventful. We trudged along, chatting about college, life, and how much we'd missed being back home. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional caw of a distant crow. It felt peaceful, at least until it didn't. We reached a fork in the trail, marked by a wooden post with arrows pointing in two directions. One path led back to the town, the other to a frozen lake that was popular in the summer but desolate this time of year. Naturally, Mike wanted to check out the lake. I hesitated, but his enthusiasm was contagious. "It'll be quick," he promised, flashing that grin of his. Reluctantly, I agreed. The path to the lake was narrower, less traveled. The snow was deeper here, and it was clear that no one had walked this way recently. About 15 minutes in, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to press in closer, their bare branches clawing at the sky, or the silence that felt heavier than before. Then we saw him. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, a man, standing perfectly still in the middle of the path, dressed in a heavy coat and a knit cap. He was facing us but didn't move or say anything. Mike and I stopped dead in our tracks. "Hey!" Mike called out, waving a hand. No response. The man just stood there, like a statue. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't say what. Maybe it was the way his posture seemed unnatural, or how his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were studying us. "Let's go back," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mike hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and caution. Finally, he nodded, and we turned to retrace our steps. But as we did, I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The man was closer now, though I hadn't heard him move. He was still standing perfectly still, but he'd definitely covered some ground. "He's following us," I hissed, my breath fogging in the cold air. Mike looked back and swore under his breath. "All right, let's pick up the pace," he said, his voice unusually tense. We quickened our steps, the crunch of snow beneath our boots growing faster and louder. I didn't dare look back again, but I could feel it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that told me we were being watched. We reached the fork in the trail, and Mike grabbed my arm. "Run," he said, and for once I didn't argue. We sprinted down the path toward town, the snow making it harder than it should have been. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the small parking lot where Mike's Jeep was parked, I dared to look back. The man was there, standing just at the edge of the trees. He didn't step out into the open, just watched as we scrambled into the Jeep. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and it felt like an eternity before the engine roared to life. We peeled out of the lot, snow kicking up behind us, and didn't stop until we were back in town. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Both of us were trying to process what had just happened. Who was that man? Why had he been out there? And why had he followed us? I don't know if I'll ever get answers to those questions, but one thing's for sure. I'll never set foot in those woods again. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm outside alone, just in case. I refused to give a ride to a man whose car broke down. I could not imagine what it would lead to. It was the dead of winter, 2020, just after the holidays. Snow blanketed everything, turning my small town in upstate New York into a postcard scene. I've always hated driving at night, but I'd promised my best friend, Emily, I'd pick her up from the train station. Her train was delayed, so it was close to midnight when I finally got her message saying she'd arrived. The station was about 20 minutes from my house, down a narrow, winding road that cut through the forest. It was remote, with only a few scattered houses along the way, and the streetlights were few and far between. My car, an old Toyota Corolla, had been reliable, but that night, the check engine light decided to blink on halfway there. Just my luck. I figured it was nothing urgent and kept driving. After all, Emily was waiting, and the snowstorm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. About 5 minutes from the station, I saw something on the side of the road, a man waving me down. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a flannel shirt and jeans, completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. His car, a beat-up sedan, was parked awkwardly on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. My gut told me to keep driving, but he looked desperate. I rolled down my window just a crack. "Car trouble?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah," he said, shivering. "Battery's dead. Can you give me a jump?" I glanced at my phone, which had no signal. Classic. "Sorry, I'm in a rush," I said. "Maybe try flagging down the next car?" His face fell, but he nodded. I drove off, feeling a pang of guilt, but also relief. Something about him had felt off. When I got to the station, Emily was already outside, hopping from one foot to the other to stay warm. She tossed her bag in the back and slid into the passenger seat. "God, it's freezing," she said, rubbing her hands together. "Thanks for coming." As we started back, I told her about the guy on the road. She frowned. "That's weird. I didn't see anyone on my way in, and I walked from the main road." That struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he'd already found help. About halfway home, my car started making a strange noise, a grinding sound that sent shivers down my spine. I pulled over to the shoulder to check it out. The snow was falling harder now, and visibility was terrible. "Stay in the car," I told Emily. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold slicing through my jacket. As I crouched near the front wheel, I heard it, footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. I froze. "Emily?" I called, my voice shaky. "No," she said from inside the car. "Why?" My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned around. There, standing just a few feet away, was the man from earlier. "I thought you were in a hurry," he said, his voice calm but unsettling. He took a step closer, and I noticed something in his hand, a tire iron. Without thinking, I bolted for the car, yelling for Emily to lock the doors. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me as I fumbled for the handle. Somehow, I managed to get in and slam the door shut just as he reached the car. Emily screamed as he banged on the window with the tire iron. the glass cracking under the force. I threw the car into drive and sped off, the wheels skidding on the icy road. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station back in town. Shaking, we told the attendant what had happened and called the police. They took our statement but didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just some guy trying to scare you," one officer said, shrugging. "Scare me?" I snapped. "He had a weapon." They promised to patrol the area but didn't offer much else. Emily and I ended up staying at her place that night, neither of us able to sleep. The next morning I went outside to check on my car. There, scrawled across the hood in what looked like dirt, or maybe something darker, were the words, "I warned you." I immediately called the police again, but they found no prints, no evidence. It was like he'd disappeared. To this day, I can't shake the image of that man's face or the sound of his footsteps in the snow. I don't know what he wanted or why he chose me, but I've learned one thing. Always trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And maybe next time, I'll skip the late-night drive. My brother invited me to go winter fishing, but what we caught there still doesn't fit in my head. This happened to me last winter, and I still can't stop thinking about it. For some context, I'm a 26-year-old guy from upstate New York, and winters here are no joke. Snow drifts pile up like small mountains, and the freezing wind can make even the bravest souls rethink their choices. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily, but what happened that night left me shaken in a way I've never experienced before. It all started when I decided to visit my cousin Nick, who lives in a rural area about an hour away from my apartment. Nick had invited me over for a quiet weekend of ice fishing, something we used to do as kids but hadn't done together in years. I thought it would be a fun way to reconnect and escape the monotony of my 9-to-5 job. Besides, the idea of sitting on a frozen lake with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional crack of ice beneath us felt oddly peaceful. I arrived at Nick's place late on a Friday evening. The drive was treacherous. The snow was falling in thick sheets, and the roads were slick with ice. By the time I pulled into his driveway, my nerves were already frayed. Nick greeted me with his usual grin, handed me a beer, and assured me the weather would clear up by morning. We spent the rest of the evening catching up, talking about everything from work to childhood memories. The next morning, as promised, the storm had passed. The sky was a pale gray, and the air was biting cold. We loaded up Nick's old pickup truck with our fishing gear and drove out to a small, secluded lake about 10 miles from his house. The lake was surrounded by dense woods, and the only way to access it was through a narrow, unpaved road. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and you felt like the last person on Earth. We parked the truck near the tree line and trudged out onto the ice. Nick assured me the lake was solid, having frozen over weeks ago, but I still couldn't shake the anxiety that came with every creak and groan beneath our boots. We set up our gear about 50 yards from the shore and settled in for what we hoped would be a successful day of fishing. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We chatted, laughed, and even managed to catch a couple of decent-sized fish. Around mid-afternoon, though, things took a strange turn. Nick pointed out a dark figure on the far side of the lake, near the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just another fisherman, but something about the way the figure moved didn't sit right with me. It was slow and deliberate, almost like it was dragging something. "What do you think that is?" Nick asked, squinting against the glare of the snow. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Probably just someone hauling their gear. But as the figure got closer, we realized it wasn't hauling gear. It was pulling a large, heavy bag behind it. The figure stopped about 20 yards from the edge of the ice and began pacing back and forth. Nick and I exchanged uneasy glances, neither of us saying a word. The air felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Then, without warning, the figure knelt down and started pounding on the ice with something, maybe a rock or a hammer. The sound echoed across the lake, sharp and unnerving. We watched in stunned silence as the person worked feverishly, their movements growing more frantic with each passing second. "We should get out of here," I whispered, my breath visible in the freezing air. Nick nodded, his face pale. We began packing up our gear as quietly as possible, trying not to draw attention. But as we turned to leave, a voice called out behind us. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" My heart stopped. I glanced back and saw the figure standing upright, staring directly at us. Even from a distance, I could feel the intensity of their gaze. Without another word, Nick and I bolted toward the truck, our boots slipping on the icy surface. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the crunch of footsteps behind us. When we finally reached the truck, Nick fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. It felt like an eternity before he got the engine started, and we sped off down the narrow road, the tires barely gripping the icy path. Neither of us spoke the entire ride back to his house. That night, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. Nick suggested it was someone trying to dump trash illegally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far worse. The bag looked too small to be just garbage, and the desperation in their movements didn't match the act of simple littering. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about a missing woman from a nearby town. Her disappearance coincided with the day we were on the lake, and the description of her last known location sent a chill down my spine. I don't know if the two events are connected, but the thought has haunted me ever since. I haven't been ice fishing since that day, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes late at night, I find myself replaying the scene in my mind, wondering if there was something more we could have done. But the truth is, I'm not sure I want to know what was really in that bag, or what would have happened if we'd stuck around to find out. If you like these stories, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Thank you for watching.